You think wars are fought with bombs and armies? They're not. The real weapon is just 33 kilometers of water. Every single day, the world moves oil, fuel, medicine, food. Everything runs on ships, and almost every one of those ships passes through the same few places. Strips of water so narrow, two large vessels can barely pass side by side. These are the choke points that control the world. And here's the part no one talks about. You don't need an army to threaten the global economy. You just need to make people nervous about one of these strips. When tensions rise near just one of them, oil prices move within hours. Insurance costs double overnight, sometimes within just a few hours. Governments start making phone calls, and ordinary people feel it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in their heating bills, all because of a few kilometers of water. And right now, as you watch this, one of these choke points is under active threat. You'll know exactly which one very soon. Remember one number, 33. By the end of this video, that number will mean something very different to you. There are only 5 of these choke points that matter most. Together, they carry more than 40% of everything the world buys, sells, and runs on. 5 strips of water. That's it. And whoever controls them doesn't just control trade. They control the world. Most of the time, they spread out across vast oceans. But at certain points, every road narrows. Everything gets forced into a single lane. Block that lane, and the world doesn't slow down. It stops. The first one is the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels of oil pass through here every single day. That's roughly 1 in every 5 barrels, anywhere on Earth. It sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Every tanker carrying Gulf oil has no choice but to pass through this one narrow gap. Then there's the Strait of Malacca. 1 in every 3 shipping containers on Earth moves through this waterway. More than 80,000 ships every single year. It connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Cut it, and Asia's factories begin to slow. Suez, the shortcut between Europe and Asia. Without it, ships add weeks to every journey. Bab el-Mandeb, the gate to the Red Sea. Most people had never heard of it until 2024. When a small group of fighters, armed with basic missiles, began attacking ships here. Within weeks, more than 60% of Suez Canal traffic had stopped. Ships rerouted around the entire continent of Africa, adding 2 to 3 weeks to every single journey. Billions of dollars in extra costs every month. One small strait that most people still cannot find on a map. Close this, and Suez becomes useless overnight. And Gibraltar. Britain has held this tiny rock since 1704. 300 years later, they still do. The door to the Atlantic, and no one passes through without crossing it. 5 points. Every continent, connected through them. Whoever controls these writes the rules. That's not a theory. That's 300 years of history. But here's what history books didn't tell you. The most powerful empires on Earth didn't win through strength alone. They won by understanding something that almost no one else saw. Something hidden in these maps. Britain was once a small island. No vast armies, no natural resources, no great land. But its naval thinkers noticed something strange. You don't have to control the world, just the places the world depends on. Admirals like John Fisher began to see a pattern in the maps. Every major trade route squeezed through the same few narrow points. Control those points, and it didn't matter who owned the land around them. Gibraltar, 1704. Suez, 1882. Aden, Singapore. Hormuz. One by one, the choke points came under British control. They didn't control continents. They controlled the doors between them. The sun never sets on the British Empire. People thought that was about land. It wasn't. It was about 5 doors. And for nearly 2 centuries, it worked perfectly. Until one morning in 1956, it all came apart. Britain believed these routes would always be theirs. They were wrong. And the reason why is not what you'd expect. Before we go any further, which of these 5 choke points do you think is the most dangerous right now? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain was furious. They launched a military operation and won on the ground. The canal was theirs again. And then, America made a phone call. Pull back, or we collapse your currency. Britain had won the battle and still had to retreat. Think about what just happened. The most powerful empire in modern history, defeated not by an army, not by a navy, by a phone call. Because choke points aren't only controlled by force, they're controlled by economies, alliances, and the willingness to use both. After 1956, a new power moved in quietly. The United States positioned naval forces near every major choke point. Bahrain, Diego Garcia, Singapore. A new doctrine was written. Whoever protects the routes writes the rules. The flag changed, the strategy didn't. Think about what that means. For an ordinary person, a truck driver in Germany, a factory owner in Vietnam, a family, buying cooking oil at a market in Karachi. None of them study geopolitics. But all of them live inside this system every single day. But here's what they didn't tell you. This wasn't just a transfer of power between 2 nations. It was the beginning of a new kind of control, one that didn't need armies on land, one that worked quietly through ships and oil and the constant threat of disruption. And that system is still running today. The world's largest trading economy depends on a route it doesn't fully control. China moves more than 80% of its imported oil through a single, narrow strait, the Strait of Malacca. That strait is bordered by a U.S. allied nation. Strategists call this the Malacca Dilemma. China's most quietly discussed fear. One decision by the wrong government, and China's energy supply becomes complicated, not cut off, not immediately, but complicated enough to change every calculation in Beijing. That's why China is spending enormous resources on alternatives. Overland pipelines, port investments across the Arab world, new corridors through Central Asia, not out of ambition alone, out of fear. And the Arab nations sitting beside Hormuz, they understand fear too. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. Their entire economic model depends on oil moving freely through that strait. A disruption doesn't just threaten them. It hits Europe's energy bills within days. It slows Asia's factories within weeks. And it raises global food prices because almost everything runs on fuel. Europe learned this painfully in 2022. When energy supply routes shifted, gas prices in some countries tripled. Household energy bills in Germany jumped by more than 70% in a single year. Millions of families couldn't keep up, all because of distant water, distant choke points that most people had never heard of. In 2019, tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz were seized. No war declared, no invasion, just ships stopped. Insurance costs for vessels in the region doubled overnight. Oil markets moved. Governments issued warnings. And when tensions have risen again in recent years, the same thing happens. The same calls are made. The same markets move. And sometimes, even at peak tension, some ships still move. not stopped, not challenged, which raises a quieter question. Is this system breaking? Or is it far more controlled than it appears? 33 kilometers. Remember that number. That's the width of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly a 20-minute drive on an open highway. A strip of water smaller than most cities you've driven through. 21 million barrels of oil, 80% of Asia's energy, trillions of dollars of global trade. All of it squeezed through those 33 kilometers. Every single day. And when that strip tightens, the entire world feels it, within 48 hours. Now here's what they didn't tell you. This isn't any one country against another. This isn't any single conflict you've seen on the news. This is a 300-year war over routes, and it has never stopped. When groups attacked commercial shipping in the Red Sea, Suez traffic dropped sharply. Egypt's economy took a direct hit. European companies rerouted their ships around the entire continent of Africa, adding weeks and enormous costs to everything. Every political conflict you read about has a choke point underneath it. The wars change. The locations change. The choke points never change. Now you know. Choke points decide who rules. Britain built a 200-year empire on 5 of them. America rebuilt global power through the same 5. And today, every major power on Earth is quietly obsessed with the same narrow strips of water. Flags changed, the points didn't. But something is happening that no empire planned for. Climate change is melting Arctic ice, and within decades, a new route may open, above Russia. A passage that bypasses Malacca, that bypasses Hormuz. That rewrites every map that has governed this world for 300 years. If that route opens, the 5 points that have held the world together could lose their power almost overnight. New choke points will form, new powers will position themselves, and the nations that see it coming will write the next 300 years. So the question isn't who controls the map right now. The question is, when the map changes, who will be ready? And who will be left behind? If this changed how you see the world, share it with someone who needs to know this. And if you want to understand the next hidden system, the one that quietly shapes everything you buy, everything you pay for, click here. It's closer than you think.